Ever wonder why some people seem unstoppable, like they're wired for success, no matter what comes their way? It's not luck, it's not talent, it's how they speak to themselves when no one else is listening. There is a secret held by all who win. The way they speak to themselves becomes the map of their destiny. A man may be given all the riches of the world, all the education, all the talent, but if the voice within him is uncertain, divided, or filled with hesitation, then his course is already broken before it begins. The winner, however, speaks with power, not because of what he owns, but because of what he commands within. Definite self-talk is not casual, it is deliberate, intentional, and full of authority. It is the first and essential seed that must be planted to create definite purpose. Let a man stand in front of a mirror and declare to himself what he shall become. Let him speak it clearly, without stammer or second-guessing. Let him say it not as a wish, but as a decision, as a command to his subconscious mind. There, in that quiet moment, when he speaks from within, he either lays the foundation of greatness, or nothing at all. The difference is not in the noise or the volume, but in the definiteness of the words he uses. The man who mumbles to himself, "I hope I can make it," plants only doubt. The man who states firmly, "I will rise, I will win, I will lead," begins to bend his entire being toward that image. The mind, like rich soil, does not care what you plant. It will return whatever is sown. Doubt planted will grow roots of hesitation. Fear sown will bear the fruit of inaction. But speak with precision, speak with power, and you sow the seed of definite purpose. That is how every movement begins. That is how every mountain is climbed, every business built, every destiny altered. The winner understands something that the ordinary mind has not been taught. The tongue within the mind is sharper than the one in the mouth. What you say to others may charm them for a moment, but what you say to yourself forms your belief, your identity, and ultimately your fate. Winners speak internally with such discipline that every word becomes a brick in the foundation of their future. Their inner conversation is not filled with loose, flabby language. There is no place for maybe, "I'll try," or "someday." These are the words of the drifter, the defeated. The winner speaks with certainty, "I am becoming, I am capable, I will not stop until I have seized what is mine." It is here that many fail, not because they are not able, but because their inner voice is untrained. They speak to themselves, as if they are smaller than life, as if they must beg permission from the world to dream. They forget that no man was born a winner, but all winners were born with the same gift, the ability to speak thought into form. That form begins in the mind. That form begins with words. You cannot build a cathedral out of whispers. You cannot build an empire with a voice that trembles. The winner speaks to himself with a voice of fire. He repeats it, not once, not twice, but daily, until that inner word becomes a pillar of strength within him. Let the man who desires change begin not with action, but with self-declaration. The world is filled with those who work hard, but think weakly. Their hands are strong, but their thoughts are soft. It is not enough to move. You must know where you are going. Definite self-talk is the compass of the mind. It gives direction when the world gives distraction. It centers you when chaos surrounds you. Without it, a man is adrift in his own sea of thoughts. Definite self-talk gives birth to definite purpose, because it forces clarity. When you speak clearly, you think clearly. The moment you must state your desire in words, you are forced to define it. There is no hiding in generalities. A man cannot say, "I will be successful," and leave it there, not if he seeks power. He must say, "I will build this business, I will master this craft, I will earn this result by this date." In doing so, he brings his mind into alignment with a single aim. That is the essence of definite purpose. One goal, one focus, one outcome, pursued relentlessly. When you speak to yourself this way, your mind responds. It organizes itself around the command you give. It begins to filter distractions. It seeks out resources, ideas, and people that match the vision you've declared. This is not magic. It is mental discipline. The winner is not lucky. He is self-directed. He is led not by circumstances, but by his own word. Too often, a man waits to feel confident before speaking confidently. That is the reverse of power. Confidence does not come first. Speech comes first. Purpose comes first. You do not wait for clarity to speak. You speak to produce clarity. This is how a man begins to forge his life. He repeats the vision. He states the goal. He commands the result in his own voice long before the world sees it. This is the private work of champions, the labor done in silence, before applause, before proof, before recognition. The winner becomes what he declares, because he dares to declare it, in the face of invisibility. When you speak with definition, your purpose is born, shaped, and eventually embodied in action. There is a law as old as the mind itself. What you repeat to yourself, you begin to believe, and what you believe, you become. This law is neither cruel nor kind. It simply is. It rewards the man who understands it, and disciplines himself to use it, just as it punishes the man who leaves his thoughts to chance. The winner understands that repetition is not merely the act of saying something again, it is the chiseling of thought into belief. Each repetition strengthens the mental image, hammers the idea into the subconscious, and forges the steel of conviction that no outside circumstance can bend. The average man flirts with thought. He declares something once and wonders why nothing changes. He tells himself he is capable, then lets the winds of the world scatter that thought like dust. But the winner knows that a single thought, no matter how noble, must be repeated, must be driven deep, before it becomes a permanent fixture in the mind. Just as one swing does not fell a tree, one affirmation does not rewrite a belief. The mind is stubborn, set in its habits, trained by years of accidental thinking. It does not change course by wish, it changes through repetition. Repetition is the architect of belief. You may begin with only a fragile whisper, "I am worthy, I will succeed, I am prepared," and it may feel false the first time, perhaps even the 10th, but the mind does not require truth at first. It requires consistency. It does not ask, "Is this real?" It only asks, "Have I heard this before?" And when it hears something enough, it accepts it as real. That is the silent power of repetition. It wears down resistance. It breaks past doubt. It dissolves fear not with force, but with frequency. One drop of water is nothing, but 1,000 drops, falling again and again, can cut through stone. Mental repetition is not mere positive thinking. It is not fantasy. It is training. It is the deliberate education of the subconscious mind. It is the way a man teaches himself a new truth, one that serves his purpose. No man was born with belief. All belief is learned, and all learning requires repetition. The winner trains his mind the way a warrior sharpens a blade, not once, but daily, until the edge gleams with certainty. Consider how easily the mind accepts negative repetition. A single failure, repeated in memory, becomes a story. A single insult, repeated in thought, becomes an identity. This happens passively. The world gives you enough of it, but the winner turns this process on its head. He feeds his mind new thoughts, not once, but with rhythm, with order, with intent. He declares his aim every morning. He rehearses his vision every night. He saturates his consciousness with images, sounds, and words that reinforce who he is becoming. That is how belief is born, not in flashes, but in layers. The subconscious mind does not sleep. It is always listening. It listens not just to your words, but to the tone, the emotion, the frequency of those words. Speak with repetition, and the subconscious begins to listen. Speak with emotion, and it begins to act. Repetition is the key that opens the door, but emotion is the force that pushes it wide open. That is why the winner does not repeat passively. He does not chant like a machine. He speaks with feeling. He speaks with the heat of vision behind his words. Every repetition is a rehearsal of the life he is building. You must understand, repetition is not for the sake of memory. It is for the sake of identity. You are not reminding yourself of a fact. You are reshaping who you are. The man who says, "I am confident," again and again, is not reciting trivia. He is declaring to his system, this is the new standard, this is the new reality. His nervous system, his decisions, his posture, all begin to respond, slowly at first, then powerfully. That is the nature of belief. Once it takes root, it spreads through every action. It becomes automatic, effortless, natural. That is the reward of repetition. The drifter, the failure, the one who never gets far, he thinks that belief must come before he acts, but the winner acts before belief fully blooms. He repeats the vision, the purpose, the affirmation, until belief catches up. He does not wait for inspiration. He does not wait for evidence. He creates the evidence within, and lets the outer world follow. Every great man you admire has done this. Whether in silence or in prayer, in writing or in speech, he has trained his mind to obey his command, and that command has been built through repetition. He did not simply say, "I will win," and leave it there. He repeated it when he was tired. He repeated it when he failed. He repeated it when others doubted. He repeated it when there was no sign of success. And eventually what he repeated became a law in his mind, and what was law in the mind became law in the world. Mental repetition is how the unseen becomes seen. It is how the imagined becomes real. A single word, a phrase, an idea, repeated with will, with emotion, with constancy, has the power to change the entire trajectory of a life. It is not glamorous, it is not always loud, but it is always effective. The winner knows that belief is not granted, it is earned, and it is earned through the simple powerful discipline of speaking the same empowering thought, until it becomes the only thought. There is a hidden power that separates lifeless words from commands that move mountains. That power is emotion. Without it, your inner dialogue is hollow, dry, without force. But when charged with emotion, your self-talk becomes a creative force, a living instrument that shapes belief, ignites will, and penetrates the subconscious mind like a branding iron. There is something deeply personal, almost intimate, about reading sacred words. Whether whispered in the quiet of the morning, spoken softly before bed, or carried silently in the heart throughout the day, sacred scripture has a way of reaching into the spaces we didn't even know were empty. And the Quran, with its rhythm, its poetry, its power, doesn't just speak to you, it speaks through you. It doesn't simply offer information, it gives revelation. It turns pages in your heart you've been afraid to read. It brings light to corners of your soul you forgot were there. The Quran doesn't just ask you to read, it invites you to feel. You can sit with its words and find yourself stirred without even understanding why, because its verses are not just words on a page, they are frequencies. They move through you, bypassing the intellectual sometimes, and landing right in the spiritual. And what I've come to realize is this: sacred text doesn't need your perfection, it needs your presence. You don't have to come to it with all the answers. You don't need to come to it already enlightened. You come as you are, with your confusion, your wounds, your questions, your longing, and in return it offers you a mirror, not always an easy mirror. Sometimes what it reflects back is uncomfortable, but it is always true. There is a quiet transformation that begins to unfold when you consistently read from a place of sincerity. You begin to feel shifts in how you think, how you speak, and how you move through the world. Suddenly, things you used to tolerate become unacceptable. You become more sensitive, not in a fragile way, but in a deeply aware way. You start to notice the subtleties, the pauses between words, the intentions behind actions, the motivations under the surface, you begin to develop a kind of inner hearing, where even silence starts to speak. And here's what I know to be sacred truth. The Quran doesn't just illuminate, it realigns. You start to recognize that much of the noise of the world isn't aligned with your soul. All the comparison, the striving, the proving, it begins to fade. You stop looking outside yourself for validation and begin turning inward, guided by verses that remind you that you are already seen, already known, already held. The words become anchors. When life shakes you, when grief visits, when fear shows up at your doorstep, those sacred words are the rope you hold onto. They center you, they calm the chaos, but even more than that, they begin to clean the lens through which you see. You start to see yourself not through the eyes of lack or scarcity, but through the lens of divine design. You see that you were made with intention, that your existence is not a mistake, that your path, even with its detours and delays, is unfolding with purpose. The Quran starts to shift your internal narrative. Where there was once self-doubt, you begin to feel trust. Where there was once shame, you begin to feel grace. Where there was once restlessness, you begin to feel peace. And it doesn't just end with how you see yourself. The way you begin to see others changes too. Judgment gives way to empathy. Criticism gives way to curiosity. You begin to realize that everyone is walking their own sacred path, each of us carrying burdens we can't always see. The Quran softens you, not into weakness, but into strength that doesn't need to shout, into power that doesn't need to dominate, into certainty that doesn't need to belittle others to feel whole. Reading sacred words with an open heart becomes an act of remembrance, not just of God, but of your true self, the one that existed before the world told you who to be, the one who knows that there is more to this life than surviving. There is meaning, there is connection, there is love, and sacred words, especially those as profound and timeless as those in the Quran, remind you of that again and again. Every time you return to them, they return you to yourself, silencing the inner critic. There's a voice inside many of us that wakes up before we do. It whispers doubt before our feet even touch the ground. It tells us we're not good enough, not ready, not doing enough, not worthy of the love we want, not deserving of the peace we seek. That voice, persistent, sharp, often disguised as truth, is the inner critic. And for some of us, it's been our companion. For so long, we've forgotten it doesn't belong. We think that voice is us. We mistake its sharp tone for honesty. We believe its commentary is just part of being human. But let me tell you something I've learned in the quiet moments. When the noise dies down and soul speaks louder than fear, the inner critic is not your truth. It is the echo of pain. It is the residue of judgment you've absorbed from others. It is the dust left behind by old experiences, old wounds, old programming. And until we name it, until we become aware of it, we let it write the story of our lives. You don't silence the inner critic by yelling back. You don't shut it down by pretending it's not there. You silence it by becoming more intimate with your truth than with your fear. You silence it by allowing a louder voice, one rooted in compassion, in wisdom, in divine guidance, to take the lead. And that shift, that deep internal rewiring, often begins when you start to internalize something greater than yourself, when you begin to listen to something sacred, when you allow the still, strong voice of truth to interrupt the noise you've carried for too long. That's what happens when you encounter the Quran with a sincere heart, not as a book of rules, not as a list of expectations, but as a mirror and a guide. The words reach places that therapy, books, conversations, even good ones, sometimes can't touch. They begin to dissolve the layers of false belief, not by force, but by truth. You start to hear things like, indeed, with hardship comes ease, and something in your chest loosens. You hear, do not despair of the mercy of God, and suddenly your shame doesn't feel like a life sentence anymore. The inner critic loses its grip, not because you fight it, but because truth makes it irrelevant. What I've come to see in my own journey is that the inner critic thrives in disconnection, it grows in isolation, it feeds on spiritual emptiness. But the more you fill yourself with sacred reminders, whether through reading, reflection, or simply sitting with divine words, the less room there is for the critic to survive. You start to replace the script. You go from "I'll never be enough" to "I was created with purpose," from "I always mess things up" to "I am constantly learning," from "nobody sees me" to "my Creator sees me fully." And this isn't just about feeling good, this is about reclaiming your voice, about not letting that inner critic narrate your life any longer, because when you listen closely, you'll realize that most of its words are rooted in fear, fear of rejection, fear of failure, fear of not being loved. But sacred words remind you that you are already held, already guided, already in. That fear doesn't need to be the compass. That criticism doesn't need to be your teacher. When you begin to align your inner voice with something sacred, you start treating yourself with the same dignity you give to others. You learn to pause when the critic rises up and ask, "Where is this coming from?" And more importantly, is it true? Often it's not. Often it's just the old residue of someone else's judgment you took on as your own. But when you bring it into the light, when you name it in the presence of divine truth, it loses its power. You stop living in a state of self-surveillance. You stop second-guessing your worth. You stop believing that perfection is the price you have to pay for love. And instead you begin to live from a place of gentleness, a place where your growth is honored, a place where your humanity is not a flaw, but a feature, where you can be accountable without being cruel, where you can change without being ashamed, where you begin again as many times as needed. Alignment with a higher voice. There comes a moment in every soul's journey when the voices around you, family, culture, expectation, even your own ego, begin to blur, and a quiet yearning emerges, a yearning not for more noise, but for alignment, a yearning to hear something clearer, purer, older than the world's opinions. That's what it means to seek a higher voice. It's not about escaping reality, it's about reconnecting with the reality that runs deeper than surface life. It's about finding the frequency that was always meant to guide you, long before the world handed you its version of truth. This kind of alignment doesn't come from trying to be perfect. It doesn't come from being praised, validated, or admired. Alignment with a higher voice comes when the soul leans in, when the heart becomes soft enough to receive, and when the mind surrenders just enough to listen, and when you approach something sacred, something timeless like the Quran, with that openness, something begins to move, not outside you but within you. It doesn't always look dramatic. Sometimes it's just the soft realization that you've been living out of step with your own essence, that the voices you've been listening to have led you away from yourself, that somewhere along the line, you began to believe things that were never yours to carry. The Quran doesn't shout over the noise. It doesn't force you to hear it. It waits, quietly but powerfully, for you to arrive with honesty, and when you do, it meets you exactly where you are. Not where you pretend to be, not where people think you should be, but exactly where you are. And in that meeting, something divine happens. The higher voice within you begins to awaken, the voice of the soul, the voice of truth, the voice that remembers who you were before fear took over. What does that voice sound like? It's steady, it's firm but loving. It doesn't flatter your ego, but it strengthens your spirit. It doesn't play into your insecurities, but it doesn't shame them either. It acknowledges your flaws, and still calls you noble. It sees your wounds, and still calls you worthy. That is the voice of God speaking into your life, not with condemnation, but with clarity, not with rules meant to break you, but with guidance meant to build you. Alignment with that voice brings peace, not because life becomes easy, but because your decisions start coming from a different place. You stop reacting out of fear, and start responding from faith. You stop striving to be seen, and start living as if you already are. You stop chasing approval and start seeking presence. This is what sacred alignment does. It shifts your priorities. It reorders your values. It cleans out what doesn't belong, not because you've been forced, but because you've finally heard something more true than the noise, and you begin to notice it in your everyday life. The conversations that used to drain you suddenly feel unnecessary. The habits that once gave you comfort now feel too small for the person you're becoming. The goals you once obsessed over begin to pale in comparison to the peace you now protect. That's the power of listening to a higher voice. It doesn't just guide your choices, it transforms your appetite. You start to crave meaning over approval, integrity over image, depth over performance. There's also a humility that comes with this kind of alignment, not the kind that makes you shrink, but the kind that makes you rooted. You realize you don't have to have all the answers, you don't have to fix everything, you don't have to carry what was never yours to hold, you just have to stay aligned. And staying aligned means returning, again and again, to the words that call you higher, not higher in status, but higher in spirit, higher in patience, higher in character, higher in love. This voice, the one that speaks through sacred scripture, doesn't flatter your illusions, it dismantles them, not to harm you, but to return you to your center, return you to what is real, return you to the sacred self that already knew the truth before the world taught you to forget. Living from a place of stillness and strength, there is a kind of strength the world doesn't always recognize. It's not loud, it doesn't perform, it doesn't need to convince anyone of its power, it doesn't shout to be seen or compete to be valued. This strength comes from stillness, it comes from that deep, unwavering place inside you, that doesn't rise and fall with circumstance. It isn't shaken by rejection, or praise, or even uncertainty. It is the kind of strength that is cultivated, not through dominance, but through surrender, and that surrender begins the moment you choose to live not from fear, but from faith, not from chaos, but from calm, not from the surface, but from the soul. Stillness is not the absence of movement, it's the presence of clarity, and in today's world, clarity is a kind of rebellion, because everything around us is moving so fast. We are told to do more, be more, prove more. We are constantly being pulled outward into opinions, into distractions, into comparisons, and in the rush of it all we lose our center. We forget that real power is not found in how quickly we can respond, but in how deeply we can be present. That stillness isn't laziness, it's alignment. It's being so rooted in your truth that you don't chase what isn't meant for you. You don't break over what was never yours. You don't react to every wave because you've learned how to stand in the water. That kind of stillness is cultivated in sacred spaces, in moments where you step back from the world and lean into the eternal. When you read the Quran not just with your eyes, but with your heart, you start to notice the shift. The verses don't just comfort you, they reorient you. You begin to feel a kind of slowing down, not because life has stopped, but because your soul is no longer in panic. You begin to carry a quiet confidence that comes from knowing you're not navigating life alone, that your worth was never up for debate, that your purpose doesn't come from what you produce, but from who you are and who you're becoming. The more you root yourself in divine wisdom, the more you begin to choose peace over urgency. You start to observe before you react. You ask different questions. You take your time, not because you're uncertain, but because you know the value of patience. You know that what is meant for you cannot be rushed. You stop measuring your success by how loud or visible it is. You start measuring it by how aligned it feels, and in that alignment, there is a kind of steadiness that the world can't quite understand, but you feel it, in your breath, in your steps, in the way you carry yourself even when no one's watching. Stillness is what allows you to hear the truth above the noise. It's what allows you to stay soft in a world that often rewards hardness. It's what allows you to forgive when you have every reason not to keep your heart open when you've been hurt, to choose joy even when sorrow lingers. That is not weakness, that is divine strength. That is the strength that cannot be shaken, because it doesn't come from ego, it comes from essence, and as you return again and again to sacred words, as you allow them to shape your inner world, you start to feel less like you're chasing your life, and more like you're living it, fully, consciously, rootedly. You stop trying to control everything, you stop needing to have all the answers, you stop clinging to things that no longer feed your soul, you create space, space for grace, space for grace, space for growth, space for God, and in that space you begin to live from a place that is unshakable, a place that is deeply still, deeply aware, and deeply alive.